Hey man, give us a thumbs up if you can hear me. Awesome. Sorry, I had some problems with my webcam. That's why I was taking so long to start. All right, so I'd like to start with some definitions. Obviously, indoctrination is defined as the process of teaching a person or group of people to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Its synonyms include brainwash and propagandize. Then child abuse, as defined by the UK government, and the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, is divided into 5 types: physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, and bullying. Okay, and the focus of my argument today will be on emotional abuse, because I believe that religious indoctrination falls under the emotional abuse of children. So let's look to the relevant emotional abuse definition as defined by the NSPCC. So they define emotional abuse as the persistent emotional maltreatment of a child, such as to cause severe and persistent adverse effects on a child's emotional development, which can be seen in religious indoctrination, manifesting as things like tremendous fear of hell. We know about the hatred of other beliefs, not just that, but the hatred of sinners and the very concept of sin itself. It may involve conveying to children that they are worthless or unloved, inadequate, or valued only insofar as they meet the needs of another person, which is religion in a nutshell. You are indoctrinated from a young age to believe that your value lies only insofar as much as the value you can provide to God or gods. So this is where the concept of sin comes from, and the concept of being perpetually in sin, like original sin in the Abrahamic religions, specifically Christianity. It may feature age or developmentally inappropriate expectations being imposed on children. Here, I would include things such as being forced to go to church, being forced to take part in activities such as praying and communion, activities which they could have absolutely no comprehension of their actual meaning. Like a child does not understand why he gets on his knees and prays to a deity that he has been forced to believe in since he was born. These may include interactions that are beyond the child's developmental capability, as well as overprotection and limitation of exploring and learning, or preventing the child participating in normal social interaction. Again, these are all keystones of religious behavior, limiting what they can and can't be taught with regards to science and evolution, and keeping them away from people who don't share their beliefs. And with that, I'll pass it over.
All right. So in terms of definitions, I'm going to agree with most of what you said. I actually had the same definitions. I'm just not so sure that your case is actually going to prove emotional abuse, but we'll get into that. So I think what's important here is that we need to look at the context of what religious indoctrination, or any indoctrination for that matter, is at the moment, because in some circumstances, you could also claim that the education system that we have is a form of indoctrination, that the media is a form of indoctrination. And so with that in mind, the context that we have it in is one where you have a better access to things like information. You have, you still have echo chambers and things like that, but it's actually harder to kind of have a belief like that and then not do anything about it. And so what does this look like? It looks like through things like social media, where even if you were brought up in an extremely religious background, you can still be even somewhat exposed to different ideas in that perspective. But then you also look at, say, the schooling system, which is far more diverse now. You can go to a school where you have that diverse viewpoint. So it's not so while a lot of these kids from their parents and their family and their, I suppose, religious authorities that they practice, they get those perspectives. It's not a case where that's the only thing they know for their whole childhood. And so, you know, a lot of those things that are easily challenged, that kind of thing. But to specifically address what you mentioned in your opening speech, that things like the tremendous fear of hell, the absolute hatred of sinners, the fact that they're worthless or unloved because of certain circumstances, I would say that that's actually like very, very extreme. And the majority of religious indoctrination, because keeping in mind that indoctrination isn't an extreme part of religion. It's just this idea that what we're saying is true, and you shouldn't be critical of that. That there are far more moderate people who do that same thing than the extremists who literally teach their kids that every sinner is a bad person and they're going to go to hell and you should never ever speak to them. They don't teach them that hell is the worst. Well, they do, but not in the same way that you characterized it in your speech. And so I think that's important to remember. And the next thing, in terms of praying, going to church, going to communion, the fact that they don't necessarily understand these things, like I would also say that that's true in the education system. Like most people don't actually understand why they learn what they do. The only thing that teachers tell them is that they'll use it later in life. That's a very similar experience, and then they draw, I suppose, value from knowing that they can do that same thing in that circumstance. It is almost identical that, this is true. I'm not going to tell you why you're doing this. And if you're not good at this, you are bad. But that doesn't constitute education being child abuse.
Okay. So you mentioned the idea of context, and that you could easily liken it to things like education, or I think you said the media, although I'm not sure I heard that right. In the sense that we're teaching children to, believe what we say without really justifying it very well. Also, you said that the context included access to tremendous amounts of information now, which I would agree with the context of it, although not your conclusions. One of the reasons religion is so tremendously damaging, especially to children in today's world, is because it completely hinders their ability to gain these opposing viewpoints. And so, for example, you mentioned schools, the schooling system being an excellent place to provide opposing viewpoints. Well, yes, that's what school is for. And yet, in the UK, I know for a fact that faith schools still exist, which is horrific. We're still segregating children based on what their parents believe about the nature of magic. And then we are fundamentally destroying their chances at a well-rounded education by segregating them together. So this is just beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. With regards to things like the internet, religion often dictates, because it's so opposed to any sort of dissent, parents will ban their children from websites that that teach them anything about evolution, for example. This is widespread in places like the United States and much more heavily Christian countries, places in Africa especially. Children are actively restricted from gaining these opposing viewpoints that you say are so abundant to them. And that is because of religion. Without religion, these children would have access to it, except there wouldn't be these arbitrary rules to stop them from going on this website or that website, or learning about evolution, or learning about where we came from or where we are, because there would be no reason to. There would be no tribal reason to say, absolutely not, you won't learn science because science isn't God's word and God's word rules in this house. It would strip every abusive parent of their arbitrary right. And for some reason, this is a privileged status that religion has and no other belief system has, to stop their children having access to information and the ability to make decisions for themselves. You also said that moderates don't teach their kids fear of hell, things like that. Kids are smart, okay? You teach them that hell is a real place and they will be scared of it. I was scared of it. Everyone I know was scared of it. And these can really mess people up, especially into their adolescent years.
Okay, just to address, I'm going to go backwards. Just to address the last thing you said, I didn't say that they don't teach about hell and being scared. I said that they teach it in a different way. That is not to say that the absolute extreme is hell. It is the worst place ever. You need to be fear of it. Like, everything you do needs to be undercurrented by this fear of hell. It's very different for a lot of moderate people. Again, you've taken like this very extreme, like all religious people are really, really bad, etc. But I'll address them one by one. So, where did that bit of paper go? So one of the last things that you said was that, actually, no, I'll go back to the start. Read faith schools. Your opposition to faith schools isn't important. Whether faith schools are good or bad is not relevant in this debate. You can hate them all you want. I also disagree with them, but they exist. whether they exist or not is not in the debate. The reason I specifically mention them and why they're also particularly good is because even in a faith school, you still have varying degrees of, I suppose, moderate religion to extreme religion. It's not a case where every single person that goes to, say, an Anglican school is that extremist that you're talking about. It's not the case where every single Catholic that goes to a Catholic school is incredibly moderate. And at that point, even though, there is a kind of bubble, I suppose, of say Catholicism in a Catholic school, you still get that varying degree of people. In the same way that, at the moment in Australia, we're going through a marriage equality debate, whether or not we should have it. And there are so many Christians who teach their kids the things that you said are so, so harmful, but they teach them to their kids, but then they also voted yes because equality is important to them. And they're the kinds of people that we're talking about. They're the majority in this situation, not the incredibly, extreme people that you wanted to talk about. And the last thing I wanted to address was this idea that, like, parents shouldn't be able to impose arbitrary rules based on their religion. At the point that we recognize that parents are already able to impose arbitrary rules for any reason, then that means, does that then constitute child abuse in the same way that, and be like, well, I don't want you to learn about this certain thing because it goes against what I believe in, withstanding religion, in the same way that I could be like, well, I don't want my child to learn about, say, the Holocaust because I'm a Holocaust denier. Not that I am, and I don't condone that. But that's the kind of thing here. That is a non-religious based, an arbitrary rule that parents are imposing on their children that we allow them to do. We don't necessarily condone it or justify it, but we allow them to do it because we allow parents the right to raise their child in the way that they see fit, as long as it's not causing that emotional abuse that you seem to think that this does. Particularly when I contextualize this to say, in a world of information, it's actually hard to have these extreme bubbles of belief and not break out of them.
Yeah, okay, so I'm actually not really referring to the extreme. The problem is that the moderate allows the extreme to exist. You can't have the extreme without moderate religion. That's how scales work. You can't have the very peak without having everything that falls underneath it. So let's work backwards. So, for example, you mentioned Holocaust denial, or just any other essential delusion that a parent should be allowed to pass on to their children without it constituting child abuse. I would hugely disagree. I think that if you're a Holocaust denier and you force your child to also be a Holocaust denier, strip them of any right to learn about anything to do with the Holocaust, tell them they're not allowed to learn about World War II because the Holocaust isn't true and you won't have it in your house, that is child abuse. I stand by that. That is absolutely child abuse because you are fundamentally imposing your own delusions on them. And let me rephrase that because we don't know what we're deluded about. You are fundamentally hindering a child's own ability to make decisions for themselves about what they would like to be deluded by. Okay, so you spoke about diverse beliefs even in faith schools. Maybe someone's like a hyper Catholic and maybe someone's really wavering in their faith. What I'm saying is that the segregation of children based upon their parents' faith in God is child abuse. That is disgusting. Okay, when you segregate innocent children and put them in different educational institutions, stop them from meeting anyone who is outside of their faith because of what their parents believe, that is child abuse in my eyes. And I would argue in the eyes of the NSPCC, as you see in the definition, these may include the overprotection and limitation of exploration and learning, or preventing the child participating in normal social interaction, which I would argue normal social interaction involves having to meet people who might hold different beliefs than you. That's how we learn. That's the reason we're on this site. That is the fundamental freedom of every human, that is to walk upon this earth, and to strip them of that freedom is to commit an abuse against them.
All right, so read the Holocaust thing, right? you should probably attack the point, not the example. The point that I made was that we allow parents to make these arbitrary rules. Perhaps the Holocaust was an extreme example, but the fact is that we allow parents to do it anyway. In the same way that parents, you can't go out tonight because I said so. Like, that is a classic example of an arbitrary rule that we allow parents to make. You can't spend time with this person because I don't think the same way that they do. Like, that does not constitute child abuse. That constitutes the way that that parent is raising that child, because that parent has a very specific way that they want that child to be raised. And so for that point to stand in your favor, you need to prove that, that leads to specific instances of emotional child abuse that you talked about in the first thing, right? The second thing that you said was that moderates allow extremists to exist. That is more of an argument against religion itself, not religious indoctrination. Like, of course, extremists exist regardless of whether moderates are there or not. Like, the fact that extremists exist does not necessarily mean that the moderate people who do this are constituting child abuse. The next thing you said was segregation equals child abuse because of all these reasons. I didn't actually see any substantive reason to believe that, going to a Catholic school rather than a public school leads to child abuse, given the specific abuse that we're talking about is emotional abuse. Like, unless, the social interactions at a Catholic school or an Anglican school or a Jewish school or whatever are vastly different to what you get in a public school and are disadvantaging that child in that emotional way, then there is nothing to say that that constitutes child abuse, particularly when, as we said at the start of this, emotional abuse is like the hindrance of social, emotional, cognitive, or intellectual development being impaired or threatened. None of those things are happening in those schools. Sure, they're happening in a different form, but they're not being segregated in a way that actually disadvantages them because their parents care about that religion. But the fact that, they are able to access information and things like that means that, sure, even in that bubble, they might not be interacting with, say, an atheist or whatever in the same way that they would should they go to a public school. They can still interact with them because it's not like going to a Catholic school means you're never, ever, ever going to speak to someone of a different faith, particularly when those schools also do inter-school things anyway. And so I fail to see how that leads to actual child abuse. So I would love to see some more substantive reasons. I think the conclusion is fine, but I need to know how you got to that conclusion from that point.
Okay, so what I would say is that I'm not necessarily arguing that every single person that comes out of a faith school, as I did, is socially impaired in an extreme sense. What I'm saying is that it does fit the definition of the limitation of exploration and learning and preventing the child participating in normal social interaction. Because regardless of the extent that you want to argue this happens to, you are limiting the child's ability to explore and to interact with normal social groups and with people that do not think the same thing as him or her. And so in this way, you are constituting an abusive relationship here, because you are fundamentally limiting their right to the freedom of expression, their freedom of the ability to choose who they're friends with and who they actually hang out with. You force them into a bubble of people who only think the same way as they do with regards to their parents' faith. All right, so Holocaust denial, I understand it wasn't just the example. I just used that as an example as well. My point is that you do not have the right to impose your delusions on your child without then allowing them the opportunity to research for themselves what they want to believe. So you mentioned arbitrary rules, things like because I said so. Because I said so is something you say when you want to keep your kids in for the night. It's not something you enforce into them to believe that no matter where they go, God will always be watching them. They'll go to hell if they don't behave. They'll go to heaven if they do. Everyone's waiting for. These are beliefs that people carry through every moment of their waking lives that influence everything they do, from the food they eat to the hands they eat their food with, to the activities they do before bed and what they worry about when they finally go to sleep. Okay, this isn't something arbitrary. This is something that deeply affects people's ability to think and make rational decisions for themselves, which is where I'd like to move on to my final point, which is that religion's indoctrination is child abuse, because fundamentally, indoctrination is to teach someone to believe something uncritically, and that is to teach someone to take things on faith and to not challenge the authority that told them so. This is an abuse because it is absolutely the opposite of progressive thinking. This is teaching your child to believe that no matter what the evidence is, they can believe the opposite and it's fine because faith has a privileged status. And that is absolutely abuse.
All right, so I'm going to address things one by one. Firstly, normal social interaction, the idea that, you can't have normal social interactions. I just dispute that on every level possible. Like, there is nothing to say that you can't have a normal social life going to a Catholic school or an Anglican school or anything like that. Like, I have not met a single person who went to a single faith school that hasn't had a normal social interaction by your standards. Like, to me to suggest that a Catholic person who goes to a Catholic school will only ever talk to other Catholics. Like, I just don't understand. Even when that bubble does exist, like, as I said in my last segment, they do have interschool things. It's not like Catholic schools essentially mean that you are only, again, ever going to talk to another Catholic. Like, I work at a Jewish school all the time, and I see them doing extracurricular things, doing activities with other schools that are both single faith and public schools. Those things do happen. Like, I just don't get this point about, normal social interactions. The next thing you said was, this idea of parents not being able to teach their delusions on kids without allowing them to question. The point I made with this arbitrary idea of, like, you can't, or you shouldn't think this because I said so. Parents use that as an arbitrary exist because I don't want to justify that belief. Sure, religious people don't. They obviously use religion to do that. But in the same sense, when parents use that phrase to say, I believe this, you should believe this too because I said that that's the truth, then, like, that also means that should constitute child abuse because you are not allowing your child to question your pattern of thinking. Like, they are the same thing. As much as you want to dispute that, they are the same. And the last thing you wanted to say was your last point about, fundamentally, emotional abuse is restricting people's idea to question things. It's hindering progressive thinking, etc. That would be true, perhaps, generations ago, where you didn't have access to those opposing viewpoints. In the same way that, that is not the context now, as I talked about in my first segment, and as you also somewhat agreed with, is that when you can access this information, you can go onto social media, you can look on the TV, you can talk to the people around you, because those bubbles aren't as narrow as they used to be. It means you are still exposed to those different viewpoints. Even if those bubbles still exist in, say, an Anglican school, you still have that varying degree of religiosity, right? What that means is that someone who's on the fringe, like, would talk to someone more conservative or vice versa. So even though they are in that bubble, like, say, a conservative Anglican talks to a progressive Anglican who believes, say, marriage equality or in LGBTI equality, you still get those opposing viewpoints. That is not child abuse.
Sure. And if you want to talk about these examples of, adult discussions such as LGBTQ rights, then maybe I would say that, yeah, the access to information really does constitute a valid argument here. Except we're talking about children. We're talking about essentially a child young enough that he can just barely comprehend the words coming out of his parents' mouth. Probably been taken to church from the moment he was born, probably christened before he could even walk. Okay? These children are not capable of, nor are they participating in debates with more or less conservative members of their religion. They do not understand what the internet is, nor do they have access to essays or online debates or any sort of critical thinking, especially not without the express approval of their parents, not until they're at least in their teenage years, when they have access to maybe a phone or their own computer. And so you've already got 10 to 15 years of indoctrination of these beliefs. And so you say, oh, well, you know, they'll get access to information that contradicts their beliefs one day. So it's not child abuse in the meantime, except that it completely shapes the way they see the world and their ability to make rational decisions based on the information that they receive. A child's brain is very, very malleable. They will believe whatever you tell them. It's the same reason a child will believe you when you say Santa is real, but an adult won't. Okay, so you have a very important responsibility not to pass on your own delusions. And so when you say, I believe this, therefore you should too, and you have no choice because you're a child and you do not know the truth of the world, I don't care what context it's in. I agree completely. That is fundamentally child abuse. And I think that that is 100% confirmed in the definition that I have provided, as it may feature age or developmentally inappropriate expectations being imposed on the children. They may include interactions that are beyond the child's developmental capability, as well as the overprotection and limitation of exploring or learning. So whether or not you say that it's been taken to an extreme extent, whether or not they have inter-school activities, irrelevant, because it has placed a limitation on their ability to explore and learn. And it has 100% affected their ability to have a regular social interaction, because yeah, sure, it might be similar to the ones that people at mixed faith schools have, but it's not the same because they're still in the bubble of belief. And not only that, it's their parents' belief. It's not their own. It's been passed down against their will when they were babies. And this is to completely ignore the responsibility you have towards you.
Sorry, that if it was specifically defined at the start of this debate that we are only talking about those specific groups of people, given that we are talking about children in general, my point still stands, given that it was not defined that, you know, we are specifically talking about people under the age of 10 or like whatever, right? The things that you said, this idea of like learning, being taught things beyond their capacity, that kind of stuff still happens to children right up to the age of 18. Like, we are still talking about all children. If you wanted to define that, you should have done that at the start of this debate. Therefore, to whoever judges this, that last segment should not be given as much weighting as the things that came out earlier. The next thing I would say to that is that even if, like, what you said is true, we, you know, teach these kids these things, you know, when they're young and they don't have access to information or contradictory viewpoints at a young age, that still happens anyway outside of religion, in the same way that we do that with education. Like, they simply cannot comprehend why they are learning the things that they are learning, why they are being taught the things that they are being taught by their teachers. Like, if we buy into this metric that is that, you know, being taught something without question and, you know, beyond your capacity means that is child abuse, then that also means that you have to stand by the education system being child abuse as well, because the children aren't able to comprehend that. They are, in some instances, learning things beyond their capacity to understand what's happening, right? So if you're going to stand by one, you need to stand by the other as well. And then the thing I would say to that is that, sure, like, a 6-year-old might not have access to information, you know, as they learn that thing. But, like, technology is being integrated into classrooms at that age anyway. Like, you can access that information at that age anyway. Like, I'm not so sure your point about, you know, they can't access this sort of stuff, they can't access anything, it is actually true to the same extent that you want it to be, because, you know, those things do exist. And to specifically address the other stuff, actually, no, I think I addressed all of that, so I'll pass it back and then we'll get each other's closing.
Sure. This is going to have to be my closing remarks. What I'd say is that I think you're being incredibly disingenuous if you expect me, the judges, and then the people watching to believe that religious indoctrination is child abuse was aimed at specifically children old enough to comprehend and understand the things being taught to them. I think that we are all well aware that indoctrination's happened from the moment that the children are born and doesn't stop until they're adults. And I'm going to leave it with that.
In closing, just very, very quickly, to address that, the idea that indoctrination only specifically happens to young people is just absolutely untrue, in the same way that people are indoctrinated at all ages. It's just ludicrous to think that like we are specifically talking about young people, given that indoctrination, as I said, does happen at all ages. Sure, younger kids might not necessarily be able to access that information at when they are taught, but at the point where that diverse viewpoint is able to be expressed to them, then that means that this is not necessarily child abuse. And it should be, if they had no access ever to this viewpoint, to question that. That's what I would say in closing.